In December 1941, when Japanese aircraft streaked across the skies over Pearl Harbor, they were launched from the most formidable carrier strike force the world had ever seen. Japan entered World War II with an armada built around 6 fleet carriers: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku, supported by experienced aircrews and doctrines honed through years of naval war games. The Imperial Japanese Navy had spent the previous decade perfecting the art of carrier warfare, while the rest of the world still thought in terms of battleships. At the heart of this fleet was the Kido Butai, or Mobile Force, a combined striking arm that could operate far from home bases and coordinate complex multi-carrier operations. It was a floating air force designed for a short, decisive war, a war Japan believed it could win before America's industry fully mobilized. The planning went back to the First London Naval Treaty of 1930 and the Washington Naval Treaty that preceded it. Under those agreements, Japan was limited to 3/5 the tonnage of the US Navy. It couldn't match America ship for ship, so its naval designers pursued quality instead of quantity. They built ships that were faster, carried heavier aircraft loads, and were crewed by elite aviators trained through an unforgiving selection process. The results were stunning. When the first bombs fell on Pearl Harbor, Japan's 6-carrier task force launched 353 aircraft in a coordinated strike that crippled the US Pacific Fleet. No navy in history had projected that much power over that distance. The Kido Butai was the apex predator of the world's oceans, but Japan's naval planners had built that fleet under an illusion that technology, training, and courage could make up for the limits of their factories. Each of those 6 fleet carriers had taken years to construct and equip. Shokaku and Zuikaku, the most advanced of them, had been completed only months before Pearl Harbor. Each required a small city of craftsmen, machinists, and engineers, and they were launched with a sense of national pride bordering on reverence. Japan's shipyards were masterpieces of precision, but not of speed. A single Shokaku-class carrier demanded over 3 million man-hours of labour and 2 full years of construction. In contrast, the United States could complete a similar ship in just over 12 months by the war's midpoint, and build many at once. For Japan, the 6 fleet carriers that opened the Pacific War were both its greatest achievement and its fatal limitation. They were the product of a nation at the edge of its industrial capacity, dependent on imported steel, oil, and aluminum. The empire's entire economy was already stretched thin, supplying aircraft and destroyers to escort its growing reach across the Pacific. Even before Pearl Harbor, Japanese naval staff officers warned that the country could not replace losses quickly. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, who had studied in the United States, understood the risk better than anyone. He had seen Detroit's automobile plants and California's shipyards. "We can run wild for 6 months," he told colleagues. "After that, I have no expectation of success." Those 6 months came and went. By the summer of 1942, Japan's striking arm had swept through the Philippines, Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, and deep into the Pacific. Yet behind the victories, the factories in Nagasaki, Yokosuka, and Kure were already working beyond capacity. Raw materials were running short, and America's response had barely begun. At Coral Sea and Midway, Japan's fragile advantage met its first real test. The Kido Butai's air crews fought brilliantly, but when 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, were lost at Midway, they took with them the cream of Japan's naval aviation. Replacing ships was hard enough. Replacing trained aviators was nearly impossible. Still, Japan pushed on. Within months, its engineers began building new carriers to fill the gap. Taiho, Unryu, Amagi, and even Shinano, a massive conversion from a Yamato-class battleship. But construction moved slowly, interrupted by air raids, steel shortages, and fuel rationing. By late 1943, the Imperial Navy had managed to complete only 6 fleet carriers in total since the outbreak of war. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, American shipyards had begun to roar like factories of thunder. While Japan's builders hammered in rivets by hand, America's production lines rolled steel like paper. In the contest between craftsmanship and industrialization, the clock had already begun ticking, and every minute brought the Pacific closer to a reckoning Japan could not avoid. When Japan launched its carrier fleet at Pearl Harbor in December 1941, America had just 7 fleet carriers in service. By the end of the war, it would have 24, including 17 of the massive Essex-class, ships that would dominate the Pacific and define a new era of naval warfare. The transformation happened not through genius or luck, but through sheer industrial power. In early 1942, the United States was still reeling from disaster. 4 of its carriers, Lexington, Yorktown, Hornet and Wasp, would soon be sunk in the desperate battles of the first year. The Pacific Fleet was outnumbered, outtrained, and fighting on borrowed time. But across the continental United States, something immense was stirring. President Franklin D. Roosevelt's Arsenal of Democracy speech had not been empty rhetoric. America's factories, dockyards, and steel mills were already mobilizing for a kind of production war the world had never seen. The Newport News shipbuilding yards in Virginia, Brooklyn Navy Yard, Fall River Shipyard in Massachusetts, and Puget Sound in Washington began operating around the clock. Workers, many of them women new to industrial labor, built ships in triple shifts, welding instead of riveting, using prefabricated sections lifted by cranes the size of small buildings. The Essex-class carrier became the centerpiece of that effort. Designed before Pearl Harbor but built in massive numbers afterward, it was larger, faster, and simpler to construct than Japan's complex Shokaku class. Each could carry 90 to 100 aircraft, operate at sea for months, and be repaired or modified in weeks instead of months. The blueprints were standardized so that parts from one Essex could fit another without modification, an unthinkable concept in Japan's custom-built shipyards. In 1943 alone, 6 Essex-class carriers were launched. By 1945, the total reached 17. It was a rhythm of production more akin to automobile manufacturing than shipbuilding. Workers in Norfolk and Brooklyn joked that they could build a carrier faster than Japan could build a cruiser. The scale of America's shipbuilding boom was staggering. At Bethlehem Steel's Fall River Yard, more than 30,000 workers swarmed over hulls under construction. At Newport News, a single slipway launched 4 fleet carriers in less than 2 years: Yorktown, CV-10, Intrepid, Hornet, CV-12, and Franklin. And at Puget Sound, the Navy's own yard launched carrier after carrier under the grey skies of the Pacific Northwest. The American Navy wasn't just replacing ships, it was multiplying them. Each new hull carried more advanced radar, better flight decks, and elevators that could lift bomb-laden aircraft twice as fast as their Japanese counterparts. Where Japan's crews took months to train, the US Navy built an entire ecosystem of air stations and training programs, turning out pilots faster than Japan could replace its losses. Behind the shipyards, a web of factories fed the machine. Grumman on Long Island built Wildcats, Hellcats, and Avengers by the thousands. Pratt and Whitney and Wright Aeronautical mass-produced engines. US Steel and Bethlehem Steel rolled plate metal day and night. By mid-1943, America was launching a new warship every few days somewhere in the country. The Japanese called it the ship flood. The sheer numbers began to tilt the war. When the US lost the USS Yorktown at Midway, it hurt. But when Japan lost Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, the blow was mortal. The difference was that Yorktown's replacement was already on the slipway. Japan had no replacements coming soon. One Essex-class captain later remarked, "They hit us at Pearl with 6 carriers. By 44, we had 6 just in the Marianas. The Essexes arrived faster than Japan could sink them. Each one launched air groups larger than the Imperial Navy's entire front line. Their decks were busy, their hangars clean and well organized, their aircraft newer and deadlier with each passing month." In 1941, Japan had held the advantage in doctrine and experience. By 1944, America had rewritten the rules of naval warfare through mass production and logistics. And behind every new Essex-class ship sliding into the water, there was a silent realization among the workers who built it. They weren't just constructing carriers, they were constructing the end of the Japanese Empire's dream of naval supremacy. By the middle of 1943, Japan's great gamble in the Pacific was unraveling. The 6 fleet carriers that had once carried its hopes for victory were gone or crippled. The Kido Butai, the elite carrier strike force that had stunned the world at Pearl Harbor, was now a memory. In its place, the Imperial Navy scrambled to rebuild a fleet it could no longer afford to lose. Japan's shipyards at Kure, Yokosuka, and Nagasaki worked day and night, but the war had turned against them. The nation that had once built aircraft carriers as symbols of modernity was now fighting just to stay afloat, literally. Air raids, fuel shortages, and a lack of materials slowed every project. By 1943, Japan's once efficient shipyards were patching damaged vessels faster than they were launching new ones. The Navy pushed ahead anyway. 3 new carriers, Taiho, Unryu, and Amagi, were ordered as replacements for the Midway losses. Engineers at Mitsubishi and Yokosuka were told to work miracles with shrinking resources. Taiho, commissioned in 1944, was Japan's most advanced carrier. The first with an armoured flight deck and an enclosed hangar inspired by British designs. Her hull was sleek and strong, her systems modernised. She was supposed to be the prototype of a new generation, faster, tougher, and deadlier. But Japan had no time for perfection. The Unryu-class ships that followed, Unryu, Amagi, Katsuragi, were simplified copies of older designs, built with whatever materials remained. Construction was slowed by shortages of steel, copper, and trained labour. What once took 24 months now took 36, and quality control suffered. Welds cracked. Armour plate arrived late or not at all. And while Japan built 3, America built 10. Every month another Essex-class carrier was commissioned in the United States. While Taiho was fitting out at Kure, the Americans launched Bunker Hill, Wasp, CV-18, and Bennington. When Unryu was launched, the Americans were already mass-producing Ticonderoga, Hancock, and Lexington, CV-16. Japan's craftsmen were producing ships of beauty, but America's assembly lines were producing ships of destiny. By late 1944, the difference in numbers was overwhelming. Japan had 6 operational carriers, the US had more than 20. The Imperial Navy was losing trained pilots faster than it could replace them, and the new carriers often left port with air groups filled with green recruits. Many had less than 50 hours of flight time. Some had never landed on a moving deck before being sent into combat. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, later called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, exposed the full extent of the decline. Taiho led the Japanese carrier fleet into battle, her decks gleaming under the tropical sun. Facing her were 15 American carriers, most of them Essex-class, protected by hundreds of Hellcats, Avengers, and Dauntless dive bombers. When the battle was over, Japan had lost nearly 400 aircraft and 3 carriers, including Taiho herself, sunk after a single torpedo ignited fuel vapours in her hangar. Her loss symbolized the collapse of Japan's industrial dreams. The nation that had pioneered naval aviation in the 1930s was now being drowned by numbers. Every aircraft lost took months to replace. Every pilot killed represented years of training. The United States replaced both in weeks. Japan's final attempt to regain balance was desperate and tragic. The conversion of the battleship Shinano, a half-completed sister to Yamato, into a massive aircraft carrier. She was the largest carrier ever built at that time, displacing over 70,000 tons. But her construction was rushed, her crew barely trained. Launched in November 1944, she was sunk by an American submarine 10 days later, before she had even fired a shot in combat. By then, Japan's shipyards were under constant attack. The US B-29 raids on Kure, Kobe, and Yokosuka destroyed cranes, dry docks, and power stations. The once mighty Mitsubishi Heavy Industries yards were a field of twisted steel. Even the surviving carriers rarely left port for lack of fuel. A Japanese engineer at Yokosuka wrote in his diary that year, "We can build a ship, but we cannot build the oil to move it. Each new vessel is a coffin waiting for its sea." By 1945, Japan's carrier fleet existed mostly on paper. The Imperial Navy, once the pride of Asia, was now a ghost of its former self. The ships that remained, Amagi, Katsuragi, Ryuho, were trapped in harbour, their planes grounded, their crews hungry and tired. Meanwhile, American carriers filled the horizon. In the Philippines, in Okinawa, and off the home islands, Essex-class decks stretched as far as the eye could see, launching hundreds of aircraft in wave after wave. The Pacific was no longer a contest of admirals or tactics. It was an industrial equation that Japan could no longer solve. The Empire's fleet, once built with such pride and precision, was now buried under a flood of steel, smoke, and inevitability. By 1945, the Pacific Ocean itself had become an American factory floor. Across thousands of miles, floating airfields, supply ships, repair tenders, and tankers formed an assembly line of war. The United States had not just built more ships, it had built an entire system that could sustain them anywhere on Earth. Japan's admirals still spoke of honor and decisive battles. America's admirals spoke of logistics. Behind every carrier group that steamed toward Iwo Jima or Okinawa stood an invisible network of steel and fuel, the triumph of industrial warfare over traditional strategy. By the end of 1944, US shipyards had produced 17 Essex-class fleet carriers, 9 light carriers, and more than 100 escort carriers, an armada larger than every other navy on Earth combined. For every Japanese aircraft carrier still afloat, America had 3 in the same ocean. In San Francisco, Newport News, and Brooklyn, shipyard whistles blew around the clock. Welders and riveters, many of them women and immigrants, worked under floodlights, turning out hulls faster than the Navy could name them. Entire sections of flight decks were prefabricated inland, shipped by rail, and dropped into place like pieces of a puzzle. What took Japan 3 years to build, America finished in 6 months. The numbers told the story. Japan launched 6 fleet carriers during the war. The US launched 17 of the Essex-class alone, and dozens of smaller ones. Japan produced 16,000 naval aircraft in 1944. America built over 100,000 across all branches. At Puget Sound, 2 new carriers sat on the slipways even as others were commissioned. At Brooklyn Navy Yard, cranes swung non-stop as workers laid down the hull of the USS Ticonderoga just weeks after launching the USS Hancock. And at Norfolk, a young worker remarked to a journalist, "We don't build ships here, we roll them off an assembly line." When the tide of carriers reached the front, the Pacific turned into an American runway. Task Force 38, under Admiral William "Bull" Halsey, operated with so many flat tops that their formations were described as cities at sea. At Okinawa in 1945, 15 fleet carriers operated simultaneously, launching over 1,200 aircraft in a single day. The skies that had once belonged to Japan were now thick with Hellcats, Avengers, and Corsairs. Even as kamikaze pilots slammed into the Essex-class decks, the ships endured. Their armoured hangars and redundant systems meant they could take a hit, put out the fires, and resume launching aircraft within hours. When the carrier USS Franklin was nearly destroyed by bombs in March 1945, her crew saved her. Then she was repaired and back at sea within 6 months. If a Japanese carrier was hit once, it sank. If an American carrier was hit, it returned stronger. That resilience symbolized the difference between two nations at war, one fighting with courage and skill, the other fighting with factories. When the war finally ended in August 1945, Japan's navy was gone. The shipyards at Kure and Yokosuka lay silent under American occupation. The Unryu-class ships that had taken years to finish were now rusting at anchor, their planes stripped and their fuel tanks empty. The United States, by contrast, had so many carriers that it began retiring them before the war was even over. Some Essex-class ships never saw combat simply because there were too many. Admiral Chester Nimitz summed it up with quiet pride. The enemy fought with valour and skill. We fought with steel, oil, and time, and we had more of all three. The Pacific War proved that modern victory no longer belonged to the boldest strategist, but to the nation that could build the fastest. America's shipyards had turned the ocean into an assembly line, and the carriers they launched changed the shape of warfare forever. The Imperial Japanese Navy had entered the war with 6 magnificent carriers, built with craftsmanship and faith in the warrior spirit. The United States ended it with 17, built by workers who never saw the sea. And somewhere between those two fleets, the handcrafted and the mass-produced, the Pacific's fate was decided, not by admirals, not by pilots, but by welders, factory lights, and the rhythm of hammers echoing across 2 oceans.